Okay, good morning. Good morning, everyone. Good morning, and again, welcome to the Hudson River Foundation. I'm Dennis Sikowski, the Science Director here, and I appreciate everyone coming today, both that are here physically at 17 Battery Place, and those of you that are on the webinar. Again, basically, our logistics, the way things work here is our speaker will start in just a minute or two, and we have folks that are. Sorry, that's okay. On our webinar, and we're not completely interactive, as those of you that are watching know. They will be able to see and hear our speaker, but they will not be able to speak directly. After the presentation, we do have a question and answer session, and those folks on the webinar can write their questions, and we will do our best to get those questions answered. Anyway, today we're pleased to have Dr. Robert Naczi here from the New York Botanical Garden. Robert is the curator of North American botany at the garden, and we're very pleased that he's coming in to talk about some work that we helped sponsor, and some of the work that he's going to talk about. This is a project that we really like at Hudson River Foundation. When we originally got a proposal from Robert, he wanted to survey plants up and down the Hudson and compare them with specimens and herbariums up and down the state. And the first look was, he can't do that. He really can't do that for the price that he wants to charge us to do that. There must be something wrong. Well, we found that wasn't wrong. Indeed, we were leveraging some work that he had already been involved with. He successfully did some work we're pleased to see is continuing. And it's a very important topic here in the Hudson, particularly with sea level rise and changes and so forth, to look at the status of intertidal plants in the Hudson. So he's found some interesting things. I'll let him explain that, but we're very pleased to have Dr. Robert Naczi.
Dennis, thank you very much for Thanks very much for that very kind introduction. And it's a great honor for me to be here at Hudson River Foundation. And first and foremost, I want to acknowledge the foundation, as I will at the end again, for their support, as Dennis mentioned. And I also appreciate the invitation to come here and talk to you about this very important project today. So, very quickly, the punchline is that I'm going to be talking about the group of plants that are the most important for the Hudson River estuary in terms of biodiversity. Now, we know so little about these plants. It's amazing. We've studied, of course, many aspects of the estuary, but this is a portion of biodiversity about which we know very little. I'll be shedding light on a piece of that, and that's my overall goal. And I look forward to answering questions at the end of the presentation. Well, it's obvious to everybody here that the Hudson River is very, very important. It's important in human affairs, culturally, as, for example, as inspiration for the Hudson River School of Painting. It's important economically, of course. We find ourselves at the mouth of the Hudson River here, and other major cities up and down the estuary, all the way up to and including Albany and Troy. And of course, it's also very important militarily. Just consider West Point and the role of the Hudson in the American Revolution. I could go on, but all of you know these things. You also know, of course, that the Hudson River is very, very important biologically. And it's that aspect that I'll be focused on today, and specifically the intertidal plants. So just from the start, to lay the groundwork, what are intertidal plants? These are the plants that live between the extreme low and the extreme high in this between the tides, intertidal zone. And there's a whole set of species that live there characteristically. Some, as I'll explain, are restricted, some are nearly restricted, and some are ubiquitous in wetlands. Well, to introduce the intertidal plants, the ones that are restricted, I wanted to mention this one species that I'll bring up again and again, and it's one of the most ubiquitous of them, and it's the estuary arrowhead, Sagittarius subulata. It is all this vegetation in this zone here, and you can notice zonation within the intertidal zone itself. That's quite characteristic. If we take a close look, we see this species is a flowering plant. All of the plants I'm considering are vascular plants, those that have xylem and phloem for transport of water and nutrients and food within their bodies. All of them are vascular plants. Most are flowering plants, but a few are non-flowering plants. They produce spores and not seeds, not flowers. And here is a closer view. You can see this species grows in fair density within the intertidal zone. Okay, also to give some more background, most of us know this, but a quick review. What makes the Hudson River estuary unusual? That's my real focus here, but also I wanted to cover some groundwork. The estuary ranges from where we are now, Battery Park, all the way up to Troy, and the tidal influence is stopped by a dam there, the Federal Dam in Troy. So originally, naturally, the river was tidal even longer, and we're not sure how long the tidal reach of the river was because that dam was put in place so early on in our history. So at 153 miles long, the estuary is one of the longest in the northeastern part of North America. By comparison, the Delaware estuary, another great estuary, is 130 miles, Potomac 110, and the Connecticut 60. The only one in the Northeast that's considered longer is the Chesapeake Bay, but much of that estuary is embayed. None of the Hudson is embayed. So it's not really a fair comparison. So if we eliminate the Chesapeake, the Hudson comes in as its kind of estuary as the longest. Now, it has a modest tidal amplitude of only 3 to 4 feet in usual circumstances. Another thing that makes it unusual, by contrast with something like the Delaware, is that the tidal portion of the river is really limited for the most part to the channel and just the beginnings of a few of the tributaries. The Delaware, by contrast, has much of its reach on the coastal plain. So the elevations are quite low and tidal influence goes well up the tributaries. But here on the Hudson, because many of the tributaries empty from the highlands directly into the river, we don't find extensive tidal influence on the tributaries. Okay, why would anybody want to study this group of plants? And there are actually many reasons, and I'd like to lay them out for the next few minutes. The first one I've already mentioned, and that is these plants are poorly known. I'll convince you of that pretty quickly, I'm confident, but my goal is also to convince you that they're very important. Not only poorly known, but they're among the most important. They are the most important, in fact, from a biodiversity standpoint for plants. So I knew going into this, because of my past work in intertidal systems in the mid-Atlantic, that intertidal plants are poorly known. But once I got here in New York, I wanted to check for myself. And so what I did was I conducted an informal survey of my colleagues. Now, I asked professional botanists, many of whom are basically supposed to know about these plants. In other words, conservation is part of their job. For example, many of them are Natural Heritage Program botanists in the various states in the Mid-Atlantic. And I checked with 31 of these botanists, and I asked them the question, have you ever seen Liliopsis chinensis? And Liliopsis chinensis is one of these characteristic intertidal species. Where it occurs, it usually occurs abundantly. So being restricted to the intertidal zone and being frequent and being of wide distribution, this one is a bit of an exception to the norm, as I'll explain a little bit later. It ranges from northern New England all the way south along the Atlantic coast and then westward along the Gulf of Mexico. So it's wide-ranging species, only coastal, only in intertidal zones along rivers. Well, only 32% of this group of botanists said yes, they had seen it. And in fact, most of the botanists said they'd never even heard of this plant. So admittedly an informal survey, but it just manifests the fact that these plants are poorly known. Another thing, now ramping up the importance of these plants, is that what we do know about them geographically is many of them are restricted to not only the intertidal zone, but to a fairly narrow area geographically speaking. And I'd like to profile one species as an example. And this is a typical example. This is not the most restrictive by any means of these species. So this is the estuary bidens, a member of the sunflower family. It inhabits only freshwater portions of intertidal zones of rivers within this range. This is the total global distribution from New York to northern Maryland. That's it. And if we look even closer, it's only 7 rivers that host this plant. Now, fortunately, this is a species that's doing well. It's actually thriving, and we find that the Hudson River is the stronghold for this species, though it goes by the common name Delaware bidens by some people. So I'm out to dispel that, even though I'm a native of the state of Delaware. Okay. Another reason for studying these plants is the intertidal habitat itself is quite rare. Consider the fact that only certain portions within the estuary host appropriate habitat. And by appropriate habitat, I mean marshes and mudflats that can host these plants. In a situation like this, we see that the bedrock descends directly to the river. Not suitable. We don't find a buildup of substrate where these plants can survive. Okay, the intertidal habitat's extreme. And what do I mean by that? Well, let's start with the tides themselves. Think about this from the plant's perspective. These plants, of course, are growing where they are. They're not capable of movement, so they are subject to twice daily, in fact, inundation and exposure from the high and the low tides. Salinity fluctuates, especially if you think about through the season. In the drier months, there's less rainfall, less fresh water emptying in from the tributaries. So the salt front from the sea pushes northward, pushes farther upstream, up the Hudson. So it's quite typical for salinity to fluctuate. Consider also after heavy rains that the salinity drops because more fresh water is emptying into the system from the tributaries. Turbidity fluctuates widely, especially because of storms. So as a result, sediments are dumped into the river, and in this system, sediments accumulate quite rapidly. Think about a plant having to deal with that sediment load. Almost always when I'm studying these intertidal plants and I encounter populations, I find that their leaves are covered with a layer of sediment, and I marvel at the fact that they're still able to survive and indeed photosynthesize. Wave action is another factor, and we add to it by our shipping. Of course, Hudson River is a major shipping channel. And then, because of all these reasons, but an added one, is that the substrate itself is very dynamic. These mudflats change in size and shape and location through the years. Okay, so this was not directly part of my work, but I couldn't help but notice it. And as an evolutionary biologist, I'm always interested in studying extreme habitats because extreme conditions select for extreme adaptations. In order to survive in extreme conditions, these organisms usually possess extreme adaptations. Well, these plants are so poorly known, they've never been subject to a study of their adaptations, their physiological ecology. We know nothing. And that's not an overstatement about these subjects. Yet I'd like to show you an observation I made and admittedly speculate about it as a possible extreme adaptation. What I noticed, the same species that I introduced previously, the estuary arrowhead, if you look closely at these photos, I shot these photos through the water as the tides were rising. And what I noticed, and it wasn't just one time, when I picked up on it initially, I confirmed it many, many more times in the future by additional observations in other places. And I noticed that the petals of this flower trap an air bubble. Now, this could just be happenstance. It could be because of the physics of the flexibility of the petals and the water coming up and pressing in on those petals. But I have to wonder if it's actually adaptive, because these are insect-pollinated plants. Remember, they're flowering plants, and remember the flowering plant life cycle. And in order to complete the life cycle, any pollen that is deposited on the pistils of this plant must grow pollen tubes from the pollen grain itself. They must grow pollen tubes down through the style into the base of the pistil to the ovary where fertilization occurs. That takes time. And there's only a narrow window of opportunity here for, first of all, pollination, and then for growth of that pollen tube. Pollen tubes usually take a few hours as a minimum to grow. So I'm hypothesizing that what happens here is the air bubble is buying time for the plant to continue the growth of the pollen tube to effect fertilization. Because otherwise, what could happen is the pollen would be washed away as the tides rise. Now, you should be wondering at this point, what about all those other intertidal species that I've not yet introduced? Well, many of them deal with the rising tides in other ways. Many of them bloom only late in the season when the plants are tall and their flowers are above the rising tides. I could go on and on about that, but basically, I'm suggesting here that this is one example of an extreme adaptation. So these plants are so poorly known, we don't even know what adaptations they have. And it behooves us, if we look at it from a selfish standpoint, to conserve these plants so they're around so that we can study them, and perhaps we'll make discoveries that will benefit human society from these plants growing in these extreme conditions. Okay, another reason, and I have even more after this slide, another reason for studying intertidal plants is back to conservation. These plants face multiple threats. And I'll mention just a few right now, and I'll return to this later on. Certainly development is a threat, and most of the development in the estuary happened early on, and the most destructive force from the standpoint of our intertidal habitats was the building of the railroads on both the west side and the east side of the Hudson. Much of the Hudson shoreline looks like this. So it's completely unsuitable now for inhabitation by intertidal plants, of course. But I won't stop with that, especially the fact that the good news is that intertidal habitat does remain, and that we have laws in place, of course, that carefully regulate development. Another aspect I'd like to talk about is one that is looming large and is already happening, and that is sea level rise. To put sea level rise in perspective, let's first consider salinity relations among these plants. And as an example, I have a group of 3 species of intertidal plants that are very closely related. They're all members of this sedge genus, Bulbochinus. These are bulrushes, as they're called. And they're important because the ecosystem services they deliver include furnishing shelter and food for wildlife. So during the growing season, these plants stand tall, almost as tall as I. They grow densely, and they provide habitat for many nesting birds, including several species that are now in decline and are of conservation concern, like the least bittern. And I've witnessed least bitterns flushing out of stands of these bulrushes as I go through them. That's just one example. And then another ecosystem service they provide is they fruit late in the season, and their fruits are fairly large, and they're important food for migratory waterfowl, especially ducks. So they're providing food at a critical time in the life cycle of these ducks during migration. Well, let's introduce these 3 species. The salt marsh bulrush, this species coated in red, is distributed down here, and it also, we have no records of it, either currently or historically, because of the development so early on in the city. But we can surmise that historically it occurred in this area because we do find it fairly commonly on the seacoast. The New England bulrush, the one coated in green, the one in the center here, this lives only in a narrow band on the river in the intertidal zones. And it's this same way throughout its entire range, which is quite narrow, from northernmost North Carolina to southern Maine. It lives only in brackish marshes. And that ecological specificity is the main reason why it's rare. And then occurring in the freshwater portion, we find the river bulrush, the one that I've coated in blue. Okay, these plants, we surmise, again, their physiological ecology has never been studied, but we surmise from their current distribution, as I've just explained, that they have very narrow tolerances for salt concentration. Well, as sea level rises, we can expect the salt front to push farther and farther up the river. What will happen? We, of course, don't know. A lot of it depends on how rapid sea level rise will be. But what we can say with fair certainty is there will be potential disruptions to the current distributions of these species. And of special concern is the one shown in blue, the river bulrush, that demands fresh water. And it's not the only one of these intertidal species. In fact, the majority of the species in my study group are in the fresh tidal portion of the river. Those are the ones of greatest concern because, remember, there's a dam. And even if that dam were not in place, there's a limit to the tide because of the elevation increase in the river. So the tidal front can only go so far. Freshwater could be displaced given time, and what will happen to these species then that require freshwater conditions, fresh tidal conditions, a very rare condition indeed, globally speaking. Okay, another reason for studying these plants is that many of them are so poorly known that we don't even know how to properly identify them. And I list here a sample. This amounts to fully 1/4 of the species I studied. 1/4 that have problems in their identification. So some have been attributed to New York, but they're outright misidentifications. It took time to figure that out, but that's pretty easy to deal with once we did figure it out. Others, the ones that I label as taxonomic complexity, it ends up, these are not just one species. These are actually what we call in systematics complexes. They're groups of species. And their classification has not been resolved. It requires study. And I'd like to put this in perspective. My larger work at the New York Botanical Garden is preparing a new manual for identification of the plants of this entire region. And it's not just identification, though that's the most important part, because correct identification is absolutely critical for so many reasons, especially conservation. But within this book, we are also documenting the morphology, the physical appearance of the plants, their phenology, their blooming and fruiting times, their geographic distribution, on and on and on, their habitats. So we're building on the shoulders of giants. Currently, the identification manual dates from 1991. It's the second edition of what we call the Gleason and Cronquist manual. And this itself is in a long legacy that dates from the earliest days of the founding of the Botanical Garden, because our founding director, Nathaniel Lord Britton, produced a manual within 4 years of establishing the garden. So this is continuing this important work. Well, the manual covers, as I say, a large area, and it amounts to 29% of the area of the continuous 48 states. I excerpt here a couple of portions of a couple of pages from the existing 1991 manual, and I do this for a reason, to bring us back to identification. So this is just one of the challenges we face when we're studying intertidal plants, because these plants are so poorly known. So if we take a look at this genus Nias, the genus, all the members of the genus are called water nymphs. That's a name that appeals to me. And I'm especially interested in this one, the Hudson River water nymph. If we look at what Gleason and Cronquist said, abundant on tidal mudflats along the Hudson River. In other words, for this species, that's the total global distribution. Coming to New York I've been at the garden now for 6 years. Coming to New York, this was one of the species on my wish list. And I was already interested in intertidal work and had done a fair bit of it. I said, I really want to learn about this species. Yet, so little was known in the literature, we didn't really even know if it was truly intertidal, because all of the species of Nias, except for the possibility of Muncheri, the Hudson River one, all of the species grow only submerged their entire life cycle. They grow in ponds, non-tidal rivers, lakes, sometimes to a great depth. So what's this report? And this is the only piece of literature that mentions it on tidal mudflats. I wondered, is this true, or is this a fluke? What's going on here? Well, it turns out this is very much an intertidal plant. It does grow on the mudflats. And that's all the only place it grows. It does not, unlike all of its congeners, it does not grow in deep water its whole life cycle. It has to be in the shallows that are exposed by the tides. Well, don't be overwhelmed by its great beauty. But to a conservationist, this is one of the most interesting species in the group because it's, after all, limited to the Hudson River. Well, the story gets even more interesting. The identification of these plants rests almost entirely on the seeds. And these plants produce their seeds only during a very short portion of their life cycle, for about a month. The seeds have to be matured. And so late in the season, we can find these specimens, extract the seeds, and identify them correctly. Well, I noticed in the process of this work that I had two morphologies of seeds. The plants otherwise look the same. And here's what the situation is. On the one seed type, the seed coat in a higher magnification, these are views from scanning electron microscopy, but in higher magnification, we can see the outlines of the cell walls here. And the seed surface is dull. Whereas in this other one, the seed surface is shiny and the outlines of the cells are quite obscure. Well, I've studied these, and in some places I find the one, I find the other, but in many places I find them intermingled. And based on that evidence, as well as additional evidence that I've been accumulating, it appears that we have two species here. The type specimen identifies the dull one as Nias muncheri. This one apparently lacks a name. Now, Dr. Donald Less from University of Connecticut, who specializes on the systematics of aquatic plants, is studying the genus Nias, and he is resolving what to do about this. But it's quite possible we have an undescribed species here in the Hudson estuary. Okay, so really what this all boils down to is, given the restrictiveness of the plants and the threats they face, these are very sensitive indicators of environmental health. So in a sense, canaries in the coal mine, but they're also an important component of our biodiversity because they are the most restrictive element, botanically speaking, in the estuary. So my contention is that these should be conservation priorities, but sadly, they have not. They have attracted some attention, but not the attention they deserve. They should be at or near the top of our list in this region. So my objective in this project is to conduct conservation assessments of all of the species of plants that are restricted or nearly restricted to the intertidal zones in the Hudson River. And this is how I did it. First, I had to come up with a list. And that sounds pretty basic, but there was no list. There's nothing in the literature that is a list of the intertidal species. That's where I had to start. So let me step back and make it even more clear, something I mentioned before, but I really want to demonstrate it now. Within the estuary, we have over 200 species of plants, but only a portion of them are actually restricted to that. So here are some of the generalists. Pickerelweed and cardinal flower are general wetland plants. They grow in marshes, both tidal and non-tidal. So they occur far inland, well away from tidal zones, but they're also on the Hudson. These are not in my target group. I have only so much time, only so much support, but it's good support, thank you. But I wanted to be able to accomplish this project within a relatively short span because I know how important it is for conservation. So I wanted to focus on just those species that are the most illuminative for conservation. And that group, of course, are those species that are limited or nearly limited to the intertidal zone. So the way that I came up with this list was I based it on my previous field experience. I had done a lot of intertidal work on a variety of rivers in the states of New Jersey and Delaware and Maryland. But I also reviewed the literature, a little bit of literature that does exist. And what I came up with is I discovered 32 species are restricted or nearly restricted. Now, what I mean by nearly restricted is a few of these 32 occasionally, actually from those few, it's usually rarely, can occur inland on lakes that have conditions that simulate tidal conditions. So during this season, their water level fluctuates quite dramatically. But that's a minority of the species, and it's of those species, it's a small minority of all the occurrences. In other words, most populations of those few species occur in the intertidal zone, not on these lakes inland. So that's what I mean by nearly restricted. So most of these plants are only in the intertidal zones, and then a few of them can also occur inland in special cases. Okay, my next job was to assemble the historic baseline. And this is where the herbarium was absolutely critical. To be able to know where plants occurred in the past, we had to have a record. And the best record, and in most cases the only record, are the actual physical specimens themselves in these museums of plants, dried pressed plants called herbaria. And this is gold. It's gold waiting to be mined. Let me show you an example of what I mean by botanical gold for this project. This is an actual herbarium specimen from the New York Botanical Garden herbarium. Here's the label up close. Let's read it. Isoetes riparia is the scientific name of the river quillwort. This is one of the non-flowering species that I've studied. It produces spores and not seeds, and of course no flowers. Engelmann, abbreviated there, is the author of that scientific name. And then we get to the heart of the matter. High water line, mouth of creek, just above Peekskill, August 1869. William Leggett, and legit is the abbreviation for collector, the Latin abbreviation for collector. High water line, mouth of creek, just above Peekskill. Here's Peekskill. Here is Ansville Creek. Here is its mouth. I spent a day there. I found abundant potential habitat for this plant. The habitat's still there, thank goodness. But the plant does not. This is what I mean by botanical gold. A physical object with locality data, most of the time that specific or even more specific. It's wonderful. These are the kind of data that are out there lurking in herbaria, waiting to be scrutinized, mined, and used for conservation. Okay, the next job, of course, was field work. And to do this, I teamed up, as I'll explain in a moment, with some volunteers and a field assistant, and we explored virtually all of the previously known historic sites, as well as some new ones. And we had a daily narrow window of opportunity, about 2 to 2.5 hours on each side of extreme low tide. So we had to get out there and make the most of our opportunities every day. We spent the rest of the day scouting for access points for the next day's field work, because access could often be a challenge. Okay, this is my team, and I'd like to acknowledge their help. Almost all of these folks are volunteers. The exception is David Warrior. All of these folks are wonderful field botanists. And David, I was able to hire part-time because I had enough funds to do that. And he helped me part of my second year and then all of my third year of the 3 main years of my field work. And then the rest of these folks, Suniti, Jenna, Eric, Nava, Sarah, and Charlie, were volunteers. And some of them, such as Charlie, came out many times each year, others once or twice. So I have a lot of help, and I'm very grateful to these folks. Okay, now to compare the historic sites with the present-day study sites. This is the way it pans out. Now, the historic sites amounted to 92, and they were from the southernmost part of the estuary all the way up to the northernmost. Pretty even distribution. Interesting because the historic exploration of the Hudson botanically was almost completely opportunistic. Only for 2 years in the late 1930s was there a bit of a concerted effort to do anything close to what I was doing, and that was focused on all plants that grew along the Hudson, not just the intertidal ones. And that was, during those 2 years, those workers from Cornell reached about 20 sites. So it was not meant to be a huge comprehensive study like ours. Now, in our study, we were able to explore in the course of 3 main field seasons and a little bit this past summer, a total of 118 sites. And you can see they span the estuary also. So our coverage is a little bit better compared to all the historic sites. But I'm not trying to pat ourselves on the back so much as just to make the point that it was very thorough. Those sites where we didn't survey are mostly sites that do not have intertidal habitat. How did we do it? We mostly used kayaks. We were able to launch and then paddle sometimes a short distance, sometimes a long way, get to the various habitats. We got out, and then on foot we explored very, very thoroughly. So what is it really like? I'd like to take just a couple of minutes to tell you what it's like. Sometimes these intertidal plants are very common, sometimes they're not. Well, this one day I set out in southern Albany County, and I was able to finish the site on the Albany County side, and I looked across the river to Rensselaer County, and I knew Rensselaer had not been well studied, especially by us yet. This was near the beginning of our second year. So I went across the river in my kayak, and I was disappointed because once I got there, I saw this timber bulkhead and then rock piled up, artificially piled up in the intertidal zone. This didn't look good. But I had made the effort, and I was at a new site in a new county, and I said, okay, it's time to explore. So I got out, I turned my back on the river, so this view is 90 degrees to this one. This is looking up into the intertidal zone. And I actually found something very significant, and it's in view here. But to make it a little bit easier, I'm zooming in. Maybe you can see it. There it is in the center, and there I make it clear. It's the river quillwort. And this actually was a big day because it was the first time the river quillwort had been found on the Hudson since 1941. And this was a decent population as far as these really rare plants go. I found 70 plants that day. Actually, it was 72 in this population. Okay, now, and I say present tense, analyzing, because this is the stage where I am in the project right now. I'm analyzing the data for conducting a species-by-species conservation assessment. The main way I do this is to compare the known historic distributions to the known current-day distributions, the ones that we documented in the course of our fieldwork. And I'm using GIS, Geographic Information Systems, to map the species, but also to conduct some basic analysis. And then through this, I'm coming up with an overall assessment for each species. And to give you an idea of how I'm doing that, I have 3 main categories. Secure, that means these plants will probably be with us for the foreseeable future. They appear to be thriving, at least holding their own. And my threshold for that is that there must be at least 15 sites, 15 populations known currently, not historically, current sites with over 10,000 plants. And then my second category is imperiled, and this means these are plants of conservation concern. They're plants that are in trouble. They are most likely ones that have declined relative to the past. At any rate, they're ones that are represented by few populations and relatively few individuals. And I have 2 subcategories. I have moderately imperiled and critically imperiled. And then Extirpated plants are those that have disappeared. They are no longer with us. We knew them because we know them from specimens. We know they did exist on the Hudson. Well, to move into the results, I'd like to give you examples of those categories. And let's start with the secure. The water hemp is a member of the amaranth family that is quite conspicuous, quite sturdy, quite robust, but also quite resistant and quite a generalist. If it's tidal, it does okay. And that seems to be all it takes. It's an exception to the rule. You remember what I was saying about salinity relations. Well, this one can take the full range. And my key here is that I show historic populations with the gray squares and the current populations with the red circles. And you can see that historically as well as current day, the distribution of this species spans the estuary. So 34 populations are known currently. This plant is doing okay. I wanted to come back to the river quillwort as an example of an imperiled species. I ended up finding a total of 3 populations, but only 129 plants. The situation with this plant is quite tenuous, as you might imagine. And what's especially alarming is that historically it was fairly common. And I want to emphasize the fact that I mentioned before, that the historic exploration was opportunistic. Botanists never went out with the sole purpose that we have of surveying for this target set of species. They just came across these plants where they did and made specimens as part of documenting the Hudson's flora, a much more general goal, an admirable one, but much more general. So we can be almost certain that there were more populations known than were documented by specimens. So this was a fairly common inhabitant of the intertidal zones, but it's a very rare one now. It has obviously declined. But the good news is it is still with us, and we did, in the course of this project, rediscover it on the Hudson, because the last collection had been in 1941. Okay, the last and the saddest category are the extirpated species. And I introduced to you Parker's kipewort as an example of an extirpated species. This is one that had been common. It was known from at least 14 populations and throughout the fresh tidal portion of the estuary. We've revisited every one of these places and many other places that seem suitable for the plant, and we have not found a single one. And what's especially troubling about this is where this plant still occurs. For example, in southern New Jersey, on rivers that are relatively pristine that drain the pine barrens. When we find this plant, it occurs in large populations. That's its population structure. Large numbers of individuals that grow densely. So it's highly unlikely that this plant is somewhere lurking out there on the Hudson, given the thoroughness of our coverage. And I get the question, well, maybe if you went out another year, you could turn this one up. Maybe we could, and I'm an optimist too, but I'm also a realist, and I'd like to say I don't think that kind of wishful thinking serves conservation very well, because we have to deal with the best data we have at this time and make decisions based on those data. Well, this is the overall summary. For these 32 target species, we find that 81% are of conservation concern. They either have declined or they've declined so far they've disappeared. The news is grim, obviously, because only 6 of the 32 species, 19%, are doing okay. Only 6 are ones for which we have confidence that they will be persisting well into the future. Now, is this a glass half empty or a glass half full? Again, I'm an optimist, and what I see from an optimist standpoint is this is a critical time in history. We still have most of the species with us. Admittedly, they're in trouble, but if we act within the foreseeable near-term future, there's a good chance we can ensure the future survival of these species on the Hudson River. Okay, I'd like to go through just a few of the species to show you examples of the decline. And the way that I do this is I show the historically known number of populations with age, the current number of populations, and then the change in the number of populations, and then the total number of plants currently known. So the river quillwort, I've already gone through that to introduce you to that, but we see an 80% decline in number of populations with only 129 plants. The American waterwort, 73% decline, only 46%. Only 46 plants. And will they be there next year? When you get so few, you worry about that kind of thing. Smith's bulrush, 55% decline, 38 plants currently known. Pygmy riverweed, 60% decline, 580 plants known in only 2 sites. So again, we have these plants. Many of them are just barely hanging on, but at least they are still there. And this is an opportunity. Okay, my object in this study is to document the patterns and assess the conservation status, not to point out the causes. But in the course of doing the field work, I did observe many things that I suspect are contributing factors to these declines that I've documented. And I'd like to go through a couple of them a little more in the coming slides. I have this whole list. I think it's likely a combination of these factors, but I've ranked them. I suspect, based on the little we can surmise about the biology of these plants, that the leading cause is eutrophication, pollution from excess nutrients. Why I surmise that, I'll give you one example in a nutshell to make it fairly brief because time is getting on. Area colon parkeri, Parker's pipewort, as well as the other species that have disappeared from the estuary that are extirpated now. We don't know about them, but we know close relatives demand oligotrophic conditions. They demand low nutrient conditions. And they're actually poisoned, so to speak, by elevated nutrients. And what I'm considering here are likely culprits are nitrogen and phosphorus. Consider the fact that for centuries, and even today, we still dump raw sewage directly in the river. This is a huge nutrient load, and that's not the only source of excess nutrients, of course. A more recent threat is competition from invasive species. Habitat destruction, as I mentioned before, occurred mostly historically. Erosion continues today, especially from waves induced larger than natural waves usually, extreme storms, of course, excepted, by the frequent ship traffic. And this goes hand in hand with the fact that the best remaining communities of intertidal plants are in sheltered areas, at the mouths of tributaries and in bays. Sedimentation, with lots of development, uplands, and agriculture, which is not a bad thing, of course, if managed carefully, we get an increased sediment load. And then dredging changes the hydrology of the river and has in the past, and is one of the threats too. Okay, I'd like to go into those 2 leading causes just a bit, the pollution with excess nutrients and the invasive species. Time and time again, and I could show you many images like this one, I see ample evidence for eutrophication within the estuary. And this is a view of a bay near Saugerties. And what we see here is a tremendous growth of the invasive plant water chestnut, Trapa natans. And it's one that responds, in fact, appears mostly to require excess nutrients for its growth. That's not the only plant here. We see a lot of others. A few are natives, for example, duckweeds. But we see a tremendous growth of aquatic vegetation under eutrophic conditions. Almost certainly not what the natural conditions were within the estuary. Another thing that I observe are mudflats devoid of intertidal plants, even though we know historically they had them, and instead they're replaced by a heavy overgrowth of an alga. Now, I'm still trying to have this alga identified. It wasn't producing reproductive structures, so we were able to get it to genus and go farther. Again, I don't know for sure since I don't know what kind of alga, but I think it's quite likely that such an excessive growth of algae is due to eutrophication, or is at least enhanced by eutrophication. Okay, 2 invasive species. Many invasives have been with us, but the problem is growing. And the first one is a fairly familiar one, and that's Phragmites. These others are recent invaders. Phragmites is a grass, these others are sedges. They're all new to the Hudson through this project. We documented them as new as part of our field work. And one, in fact, is a new discovery for the state of New York. The one is actually a serious threat to invasive plants because of its aggressive tendencies and the fact that it is already taking over mudflats where it is growing. Well, I don't want to leave you depressed. That's the last thing. There are reasons for hope. There are things we can do as individuals and collectively. And one of the things that excites me the most in this department is just within the last couple of months, we have the final Hudson River Estuary Habitat Restoration Plan published by the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation, the DEC. Now, I want to be a little critical, but then I'm going to give a pat on the back too. The DEC, to their credit, put out the draft plan for public comment. It was severely lacking when it came to botany, any botany. Little token mention of submerged aquatic vegetation. No mention at all of intertidal plants. Just further evidence of how poorly known these plants are. And you can see I have almost missionary zeal in making these plants known. Well, back to the seriousness of this, and to give them a pat on the back, I and David Warrior individually wrote long letters documenting the importance, the biodiversity, the ecosystem services of these plants. And fortunately, the DEC personnel did update the plan, and we like what we see in this current plan. This is a great plan, and of course what we need to see is other communities are developing some of their own plans. For example, Nature Conservancy has been working on that, and my hat's off to them, a bit more of an integrative, more comprehensive plan. I hope we can all come together, but of course the biggest need right now are the funds to enact the plan. But this is a step in the right direction, and let's hope we are able to follow through with true restoration within the next few years, because time is critical. Okay, another reason for optimism is that through this work we were able to identify critical areas, those areas hosting the best examples in terms of the greatest concentration of the intertidal species as well as the highest quality habitats. So what I've done here is I've listed historically the top ranking sites and then the currently top ranking sites. So we find, for example, Rogers Island came in at the tops historically with 13 known species of intertidal plants. Current day, the Stockport Creek mouth comes in as the tops with 10. So these are the sites that we would want to give top priority for restoration, management, and overall conservation activities. So that's another good thing that comes out of this work. Another good thing that comes out of this work is we provide the current data to the New York Natural Heritage Program, which is a program within the New York State DEC. And through this, we're able to realign the ranks. New York Natural Heritage Program is the body that has the charge of officially assigning conservation ranks to the state's rarest plants, to those plants of conservation concern. And there are realignments that are needed. And what I've done is I've highlighted in red the ones that are in more serious need. In other words, they've declined, they're in worse shape than the state had realized. But then we have some other species that are doing better than the state had realized. They have a system of rankings. S stands for state. S1, those are the rarest plants, the ones most imperiled, the ones in greatest need of conservation. And those are known from 1 to 5 sites all the way to S3. And it goes beyond. S4 and S5 are ranks given to those plants that are considered not of conservation concern because they're considered secure. So S1 through S3, S3 all the way up to 35 sites. So we can see there were a couple of species that are currently on the list that need to be removed because they're based on misidentifications. But then of those that are identified correctly that remain on the list. 3 of them should be given higher priority conservation-wise. And then 3 others should be downgraded, less priority. They're still priority, but less priority, except for this one. The estuary arrowhead that I've profiled several times, that one ends up being so common, we really should take it off the list. Conservation always deals with limited resources. We need to channel those resources and not spread it out too much. But the good news is when we focus on a habitat that hosts one of these, we almost always will get others like the more common estuary arrowhead. Okay, to wrap things up now, I want to summarize but also drive home the message. Why are these plants so important? Why does it matter? Why should we be studying even more so intertidal species? The first one is, this study is the first ever comprehensive study of this set of plants, the plants restricted or nearly restricted to the intertidal zones of the Hudson River. Secondly, these plants are worth conserving. They're inherently important elements of biodiversity. They're elements of our shared natural heritage. This is our natural legacy that unfortunately is in the process of disappearing before our eyes. Next, intertidal plants do provide essential ecosystem services. This is something I only highlighted a couple of times briefly in my presentation. They stabilize shorelines. All I have to do, and I speak on this topic frequently, is mention one word, and that word is Sandy, and people get it. Will these plants stop a 15-foot storm surge? No. We have to be honest about this. We have to put this in perspective. But what these plants do is they stabilize shorelines. And stable shorelines abate the power of a storm surge. And we're recognizing that now. Fortunately, we can still have time to make a difference before the next big storm comes. So not only stabilize shorelines, they buffer the effects of storms, but another ecosystem service, and I did mention this briefly, but many of the species do this, the little we do know of them, is that they provide food and shelter for wildlife, other elements of our biodiversity. And if you're a sportsman, for example, you like to fish or you like to hunt ducks, you should be, and you are interested de facto in these plants. As I mentioned, intertidal plants are sensitive indicators. They're among the best indicators that exist in the at least botanically, they are the best indicators. But in the entire estuary, they're among the best indicators of ecosystem health. And as if we needed another message that our ecosystem is not healthy, we have it today. And then finally, looking on the positive side, we do have most of these species with us, and this work can and I hope will inform restoration projects. And I'm happy to report that I am working with the DEC. We're starting with work to manage and restore Piermont Marsh, just south of the Tappan Zee Bridge on the west side of the Hudson. So that's some good work that's happening and moving along right now. So by this point, I hope that I've convinced you that not only are these plants interesting, but they are the most important elements of botanical biodiversity in the Hudson estuary. And I'd like to wrap up by acknowledging again the Hudson River Foundation. Thank you. I also received financial support from an anonymous private trust. And my colleague Stefan Chenault from the New York Botanical Garden was so influential and remains so influential in helping secure funding for this work. My former colleague Lindy Ostro also. I received permission from a variety of herbaria, 8 of them, the Bailey Hortorium at Cornell University, the Brooklyn Botanical Garden Herbarium, the Gray Herbarium of Harvard, the New York Botanical Garden, New York State Museum in Albany, the Academy of Natural Sciences of Philadelphia, the U.S. National Herbarium, Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C., and Bard College here along the Hudson. And then I mentioned my field assistants previously. Thank you again to them. Charlie Zimmerman, one of my field assistants, also did double duty. He was the one who took those beautiful photos with the scanning electron microscope of the seeds. And then finally, I received a lot of help with the mapping of species and GIS analyses from Becky Hurdy and my daughter, Michelle. At this point, thank you, and I'll be happy to answer questions. Yes?
I differ with you about the most important plants in the Hudson River are phytoplankton.
I mentioned from a biodiversity standpoint.
Even
I didn't say ecologically.
Even from a biodiversity standpoint, we have a huge range of phytoplankton in the Hudson, and it's been our experiences that they're on a decline. Ever since Sandy, we noticed, we check the rivers every other week, and we notice a decrease in plankton, in diatoms, and therefore somebody else should take that into mind also. And the second thing is, how much of these edges of the riverfront are in private hands, and how many are in public hands? And how many of them are like that big estate that came down to the river, and there were sort of hedges growing along the stone wall that we get access to? And in light of rising sea levels, are these plants going to be able to survive the rising sea levels, or should we think of other plants that will survive better in deeper water along the edge?
Thank you very much. I think you have some great points there. The first one on the phytoplankton, I agree. We should learn more and we should be very concerned about these declines. It sounds like you and I should get together and put our heads together and study overall trends in diversity. And I would like to see that happen with many of us who are studying various elements of biodiversity, having an even more comprehensive and integrative approach to this. And then secondly, your question about ownership. I was able to access lands in public ownership as well as private lands. And with the private lands, I'm happy to report that every single time I asked, and it was a considerable number of times, every single time I asked for permission to access private lands, I was granted permission. And what really was gratifying was I ran into a tremendous number of people, landowners and other locals, who are vitally concerned about the Hudson and its health. And there are many, many people out there, as you probably know, who really have a vested interest in this, and others not a vested interest, but they care, and they care a lot, and they're willing to channel their energies. So, as an example, New York State DEC sponsored a public meeting on Piermont Marsh in late September, and I was one of the scientists who presented there on the state of knowledge of Piermont Marsh. And it was very wonderful to see the huge turnout and the level of interest. Not everybody was pro what we were presenting, but at least they were interested and they showed up. So I've not had any problems. When you approach people carefully, you explain. Maybe it also helps that I represent a private nonprofit and I'm not big government. But when I explained the conservation value of the work I was doing, people got it immediately and they were interested and they said, we'd like you to survey our land. Now, will those riverfronts be suitable for future habitation of intertidal plants? Well, maybe it's a bit circular because the reason I was going to those places is they still hosted intertidal habitat. But I did run into a few people in adjacent lands whose lands had been modified, and they asked me about restoring them. They said, I want to have a more natural waterfront. So I think there's a lot of public interest in that out there, and I'll leave it at that because I know there are a number of other questions. Yes? Yes?
I think this is, among many other things, it's very valuable as a sort of baseline effort. But there's a lot of concern now, as you know, about climate change, and so I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about that. Should the climate be changing, getting warmer, for example, among other things?
Could you repeat the question?
Yes. Oh, yes, thank you. And I should repeat all the questions. Thanks for that reminder, Dennis. So the question is, what about climate change? And I'm glad you asked that question because one of the main reasons I brought up sea level rise is, of course, that is a direct consequence of warming climate globally. That won't be the only consequence. Most of us, if not all of us here in this room, are gravely concerned about it. We should all, through society, of course, be concerned. We don't know what's going to happen. First of all, we know so little about these species. So the first thing is we need to learn more about them. Some of them, we don't even know if they're annuals or perennials. We need to learn about the basic aspects of their life cycle. Another thing is, and I'm glad to see some of my colleagues here from the Greenbelt Native Plant Nursery on Staten Island, part of New York City Parks Department. This is an institution that propagates native plants. And I'd like to work with folks like those at Greenbelt Native Plant Nursery so that we can get these plants in cultivation, learn how to propagate them, and then stocks of them will be ready for any future restoration activities. I think we should start learning as soon as possible how to do all of these things, including the end result of restoring. And once we restore, we have to monitor, we have to follow through and make sure that these restorations are succeeding. What will be happening as sea level rises and other consequences of climate change come, it's not possible for me to predict. None of us can accurately predict, but we do have some good models, and I think we should work with the modelers and learn more. Oh, and I should mention, of course, Ed Toth, the director of the Greenbelt Native Plant Nursery. Thank you, Ed, for what you and your staff do. And I'm open to working with you if we can.
More critically, we also bank seed. And we now do that regionally as the Mid-Atlantic Regional Seed Bank. And in fact, we have a 2-year contract with the Department of Interior to collect seed of coastal species on the Mid-Atlantic. So
that's great.
See us being out on the Hudson in the next 2 years.
Wonderful. Now, for those that are on the web, I'm going to repeat what you just said, Ed, in case they didn't catch all of that. So one of the most important things that Ed Toth, the director of the Greenbelt Native Plant Nursery on Staten Island, just mentioned is that as part of their conserving native species, they have seed banking. And it's actually, I can say from my own experience, touring the facility and being involved in some of the seed banking projects, especially the Mid-Atlantic Regional Seed Bank, is it's a tremendous operation. Of course, it needs more support and more resources, but it's a very good step in the right direction. And currently, Ed and his staff have a 2-year contract to work on seed banking coastal species. So I'd be happy to work with you if we can as part of that. Good news. Thank you. Yes?
I see there's 3 things that I'm curious about. I'll take them in ascending order, just see if you have some opinion about it. The Piermont has been, and to some degree Iona Island, there's been a bit of controversy about the use of herbicides to remove the Phragmites. I'm just curious if you have an opinion on that. Second, Metro North is now very eager to do a major armoring of the railroad that's along the river. And they don't have the funds right now. I'm curious if you feel that that's something to be concerned about. The third is we're sort of in a boom time now for some real estate development in some areas, and I'm wondering, that slide you showed with pollution with houses in the background, I'm assuming that some of that pollution is coming from either fertilizer runoff or septic tanks or whatever it is, and I'm wondering if you have those 3 things.
Okay, so
three little things.
Sure, to repeat the question, David was just asking me about 3 threats. And the first one is herbicides as a potential threat for control, especially Phragmites. Yes, it's very controversial. I am one who does not like to use herbicides and would like to see that as the last resort. But the challenge of our times is how to control invasive species on a landscape scale. And we need more research on that. We actually needed it yesterday. So I would not totally rule out the use of certain herbicides, but they bring with them their own problems. And as I say, if we're to use them, we should do it carefully, on a smaller scale, monitor the effects, and to answer your question, I've seen that done by DEC at Iona Island with some success, some good success. So for example, I visited as part of my fieldwork, along with some of my volunteers, we visited a portion of Iona that had been sprayed. And we were there 2 years after the spray, and we did see a rebound of the native intertidal plants. How long will that last? That's the big question, because we can't turn our back on that. Okay, another threat you mentioned is the armoring of the railroads proposed by MTA. I don't know enough about the project, but I am concerned. I don't know enough to just say absolutely no. But what I'd like to see is enough consideration to restoration as part of that project. But that's, of course, pie in the sky. Maybe I'm too much of an idealist. And then third, you asked about the development very close to the shore of the Hudson, such as I showed in the one slide with the eutrophication by all the water chestnut in the bay. It's a problem when we have runoff from lawns and from agricultural fields very close to the river. So at the least, we should have buffers in place, and those should be maintained by law, and there should be enforcement. That's the problem, is development often occurs and there wasn't the enforcement to follow through. So we have to be careful, and we as a society have to demand that laws be enforced. Okay? I'll leave it at that. Yes?
Hi. Are you giving any consideration looking at subtitle plans? I asked for selfish reasons. I'm doing some work with eelgrass, which is more marine beyond your zone, but obviously within the Hudson, it's also critical.
Absolutely. So the question was, am I also looking at subtidal plants? When I can, yes, because as I described, my major project here is documenting all species that grow spontaneously within this huge portion of northeastern North America. So that means all plants. So when I'm out there, I look for eelgrass, and I've documented some populations as well as some of the other aquatics, both native and non-native, including invasives.
Is that in a report somewhere that
I'm working on it. So remember, I used the present tense. I said analyzing. So I haven't written it up yet, but I'm going species by species. So that's what I'm working toward is yes, a manuscript for publication. And that's the goal, is to share this with the community. Yes?
Well, your dissertation was certainly informative, and to me personally, it was inspirational. And along those lines, I would personally like to get out on the river, along the banks, and discover these plants, not for myself, but with someone like yourself or one of your other volunteers. And I'm wondering whether you, your organization, or perhaps some other organization that you know of, offers field trips where we can get our feet muddy and walk out along the intertidal of the Hudson. And just to add to that, American Literal Society would be a great inspiration to you folks, because at ALS we give regular walks, but most of those are along the shore of Jamaica Bay and other gateway national recreation area sites. But we do bird walks and intertidal walks, beach walks, and so on. So I'd just be interested in expanding my own experiences by joining you or your colleagues. Can you comment on that?
Yes, thank you very much, first of all, for your kind words. And then the question was, could an average citizen get out and experience these intertidal habitats with someone like a biologist like myself? Thank you for that suggestion. I've actually contemplated that. It's only a few hardy souls that have asked me, because it is indeed muddy and wet. So as long as people are up for that. And the other big consideration is, as long as we have a spot that will not suffer too much, because a lot of these habitats are fragile. But I do have some places in mind that are fairly close at hand and fairly easy access. So let's talk more. I want to give you my card, and I'd like to get your card. And also, the questioner mentioned the American Littoral Society as a good organization that already does this kind of thing, especially in Jamaica Bay. So thank you. Sounds great. I would like to do that, is my quick answer. Yes?
Rob, thanks for your talk. I thought it was just beautifully organized, and I want to congratulate you on your presentation. There's a question up on the board about rare plants and propagating them. David Barnett's question. And I was hoping maybe you could take a look at that. And also, I'm often frustrated in New Jersey when it comes to trying to collect seeds of S1, S2 species from state lands. There's practically just a complete obstacle when it comes to thinking about propagating rare plants. And I'm just also wondering, in the intertidal zone in New York, since it's the intertidal zone, does that make most of those sites state land like it does in New Jersey? So basically all these plants are on state land. And do you have any, you think that there will be problems in trying to collect seeds for seed banking, trying to do germination studies, any of those things, with regard to that question?
Okay. First, Emil, thank you very much for your compliments. I appreciate that. And then the questions are largely about propagation, restoration, that kind of thing, and also ownership of the land. So let's be sure I answer all of that. Okay, one of the questions, and you're referring to this from David Barnett, for those plants that are endangered, would it make sense to actively propagate these plants and to repopulate available restoration sites? Yes, I think so. So if I'm understanding the question correctly, we have to gather the seed, we have to learn how to propagate it, we have to build up stocks, and as I'm hoping, we can get some help with people like Ed and his staff from Greenbelt. And then I think we should augment the existing sites, but then also work to restore the sites that were known historically as hosting these plants. Now, it's a bit more controversial. Should we then go out and play Johnny Appleseed and go to sites where these species were never known? Well, if it's local genetic stock and we're restoring sites that appear to be suitable for that species, and it's not an isolated species at a time, but it's part of a community, I would lend my support to such an effort. But that's something that needs careful planning, and I shouldn't be the only one who's weighing in on it. It should be by a team of experts that make these kind of decisions. And then, Emil, you were asking about access. So my understanding is actually tidal lands are federal. Maybe I'm wrong about that. But if they're not, they're state?
I think it belongs to the state.
Okay. I know in New Jersey, much of it's state. I thought in New York it was mostly federal, but Dennis just corrected me. Thank you. I don't know how much to say here, but I'll fess up a little bit. I almost got arrested by a military policeman because he thought I was on military land when actually I wasn't. And when he summoned me over out of the marsh, I won't mention where this happened. It wasn't West Point, it was somewhere else. And I knew I was in the right because it was public land. But when he had his hands above his hips, above his guns, and he grimaced at me when I suggested that this was public land, I knew I better shut up and get out. So I did, but at any rate, you make a good point that adds to the comments we were making earlier about access and ownership. The private lands that I was talking about were points of access, the lands immediately adjacent to the intertidal zone. Thank you for the clarification. That's a very important point to make, is that it's actually public land, the intertidal zone itself. Heather?
Just to comment on your permitting issue, I think, at least for us here in New York City after Sandy, we saw a huge push for communication between departments. And, I mean, we started a whole collection program within Jamaica Bay, which we never had access to before. And to be able to do seed collection on National Park Service land with their support and consent was a huge jump in this problem that happens, especially between departments. So I think that it's getting better, and I think that studies like this are actually moving those relationships forward in a positive way. So hopefully with this study, the state of New York is going to be much more ready for the Mid-Atlantic Regional Seed Bank to come in and say, this is what we can do. How can we work together to make it happen?
Thank you, Heather. I agree. That's been my experience, is that it's becoming a little bit easier now to get permits. That's a good thing. And we need to keep up the pressure. The point I think you were making, Emil, that it serves conservation best when we do appropriately have access to these populations. Dennis?
Robert, just wondering, a lot of your collections took place, I think, prior to Irene and Lee. And with the sort of devastation of a lot of the SAB beds within the Hudson, Have you noticed, is there any, at least anecdotal information of whether that increased sedimentation may have even been positive or negative in terms of the intertidal plants?
Okay, great question. Did these big storms we have, Sandy, Irene, and even previous big storms, tropical storms and hurricanes, did they have any positive or negative or any obvious effect on the intertidal plants? And I'm glad you asked that because I was very interested in that. And I went out not only immediately after some of these storms, not Sandy because it was already at the end of the season, October 29th. My season was over by now. But I went out the following year. And in terms of Irene, I was out that same season within 5 days of the storm. So I did not notice any negative effects. I at first thought I would, but then upon further reflection, I think I understand why. Because obviously the tides still fluctuate during these storms and immediately after the storms, but the water levels were already so high that even at low tide, much of the intertidal was still covered in water at the time. And that water provided protection to the intertidal zone. So that's a hypothesis, but I did not notice any deleterious effects following Sandy or Irene. So I think these intertidal plants in some ways are pretty resilient as long as the habitat is there. Now the sedimentation that you mentioned, that's something I really wonder about, and I don't understand it because in some areas I see very little sedimentation, but in other areas I see a lot, and obviously I need to get together with somebody who really knows more the physical aspects of sedimentation and the hydrology and currents and all that kind of thing. And I know like nothing about that. So here's where teamwork would really pay off.
Talking after we got a couple projects going on.
Great. Okay, thank you. Yes?
If you were to consider repopulating those sites at which some of those plants have been extirpated, do you think you'd have to choose sites where you wouldn't have to mitigate a lot of the stressors that were already there that may have caused those populations to become extirpated in the first place? And do those sorts of areas exist along the Hudson, like areas where there is less eutrophication or less development and runoff and that sort of thing?
Great question. So the question there is, in prioritizing sites for restoration, do we already have some good sites in existence that have relatively few threats or low level of threats? Do we have to go in and mitigate those threats? Well, my biggest concern are the pervasive threats, like excess nutrient pollution, because that's estuary-wide. And I'm not the first one to point that out, obviously. Really, that's a major problem for all of society, because it isn't just sewage, it isn't just agricultural runoff, of course, but we are raining down on ourselves fertilizer, because when we burn fossil fuels, we're nitrifying the atmosphere. And I see these kind of concerns not only for the intertidal, but I see them across the landscape. That is my biggest concern. And fortunately, I've had the opportunity to talk with one of the scientists who serves on an international panel considering the nitrogen problem. And it's only in its infancy. So we need to keep an eye on that. So how do we mitigate that? I don't know. And I asked him that question. We don't know. We collectively don't know yet how to deal with that. So if we could, we would, but that problem is larger than us. And we need to come together internationally and really start grappling with it. Okay, more point sources. Certainly there are a few places that we could mitigate, but on the bright side, there are some places that are in good shape. And one of the places that I identified, surprisingly, was the Croton River. This is within Westchester County, of course. I had people say, oh, that was the big dump. Well, the big dump was on Croton Point. The landfill, it was a mess in the past. But the first exciting thing was the Croton River hadn't been explored for intertidal plants. The second one is it has, unlike most tributaries, it has a tidal reach of just over a mile, which is a lot for the Hudson for a tributary. And it's protected. Yeah, there's a lot of trash there, but there are a lot of rare intertidal species there. So that's the sort of situation that we can start with as long as we get all the clearances and permissions necessary. There are a few other places that could really benefit from some work, both in federal hands and in private hands. So I hope I'm answering your questions, but it's really a whole continuum is what I've witnessed.
Thanks.
You're welcome.
Good to meet you.